Palestine to Yemen to Syria to Iraq. And we're seeing an increased amount of fundamentalist violence being exercised outside of the Middle East and being conducted even in our Western nations. Most recently, of course, the tragedy in New York of a couple days ago. But one terrorist organization with an extremely long reach and who has used extremely violent tactics is, of course, the Islamic State. So I want to talk a little bit about where the Islamic State comes from. And in doing so, we really have to address four major themes. We have to understand the long-standing ethno-religious tensions that characterize much of the Middle East. We have to evaluate the role that the U.S. invasion and subsequent withdrawal of troops from Iraq had on the rise of the Islamic State. We have to look at the continuing corruption and incompetence of the Iraqi government, and we really have to focus on the role of an increasingly powerful Iran within the region. So I'm going to try and switch slides, and hopefully that will happen. Any slide change? Well, we'll see. So when we start to analyze the Islamic State, we first have to really ask, well, what is it? And so I want to give a brief summation of what is the Islamic State, what are their goals, etc. So in short, the Islamic State is a Sunni extremist group with the stated purpose of establishing an Islamic caliphate throughout the Middle East. Okay? And so when we're talking about a caliphate, what we're really talking about is the creation of a state. And a state is a geographic area controlled by the Islamic State. The centralized authority is going to be the supreme religious and political leader. So in many Western democracies, there's a significant separation of church and state. In an Islamic caliphate, that is not the case. The state is the religion. The religion is the state. And really what the Islamic State is doing is they're trying to adopt a revisionist ideology. They're trying to return to a previous era of great glory for Islam. So, of course, if this state emerges, and some will argue that it already has, we will not find those institutions that we've come to recognize in our Western democracies. You know, the institutions of an Islamic caliphate, they're going to be derived by some form of Islamic law, and they're going to be one moment, please. Dr. Squires had a valid point here. Okay, hopefully.
Dr. Arsenault, when you clicked on those individual slides, it did change, so I didn't notice that.
All right, let me try again here. I have a couple different screens going on here. Again, our apologies. This is the first time we've tried to do this speaker series. That look. Oh, okay. Here we go. We'll try this. So the Islamic Caliphate is really adopting this revisionist ideology of trying to return to a point in history where Islam was one of the great civilizations. You know, an era of past glory, etc. Now, the current caliph, or the successor to Muhammad, who's currently controlling this organization, is Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. And al-Baghdadi means nothing more than of Baghdad. You know, it's a nom de guerre, an alias. And the history of al-Baghdadi really remains pretty cloudy. But what we do know is that al-Baghdadi comes from a deeply religious family, a Sunni family. He reportedly holds a PhD in Islamic studies from Baghdad University, which prior to the invasion was still a very strong, reputable um, institution. And most importantly, what we know is that al-Baghdadi, along with many Iraqi Muslims, became increasingly fundamentalist following the U.S. invasion of Iraq. And it wasn't until 2003 or so that al-Baghdadi even became um, notable in U.S. intelligence reports. And we have to remember, this is 14 years ago. You know, we're still dealing with the Islamic State in 2017. 14 years ago, we start to see the emergence of this organization. So shortly after the invasion of Iraq, al-Baghdadi began to form a Sunni militant group, which was designed to combat U.S. forces and foreign contractors, and probably more importantly, the secular Iraqi government that was emerging at that point in time. And if we remember, we started to see a really strong increase in the insurgency in Iraq. And al-Baghdadi's organization began to merge with other insurgent groups, and they ultimately form Al-Qaeda in Iraq. Okay, it's often called AQI, and this is the organization that is the precursor to the Islamic State. So even as early as 2003, we start to see the beginnings or the emergence of Al-Qaeda in Iraq. And so throughout the Iraq War, the U.S. forces conducted a number of counter-terror operations. Counter-terror operations, I guess to put it in a nutshell, is killing bad guys. And so through these counter-terror operations, a number of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, AQI, precursor to the Islamic State, they're killed. And out of all these killings, al-Baghdadi came to command Al-Qaeda in Iraq in 2010. And he remains in command of AQI, the precursor to the Islamic State, from up to present day. So 2011, the U.S. forces withdraw from Iraq, and we see a tremendous amount of power struggle emerge. Well, a lot of this was replaced by Islamic fundamentalism, right? We start to see the Islamic State emerge from Syria back into Iraq. Okay, so that's kind of where the Islamic State emerges, but I want to start talking about the causal variables that led to the Islamic State. So what we really need to ask is, where does the Islamic State come from? You know, it's a difficult question to answer because the scope of inquiry could go back from the ancient times of Islamic caliphates, etc. But for me, when we're looking at a specific organization, we need to really focus on, when did the Islamic State emerge? And that point in time is with the U.S. invasion of Iraq. So the U.S. invasion of Iraq, which was a failed foreign policy, we'll get into that later, but it did indeed lead to the rise of this fundamentalist Islamic group. That being said, we need to think about 5 key turning points that led to the rise of the Islamic State. First, we need to recognize the deep-seated ethnic and religious tensions that were underlying the Iraqi state for many, many years. However, it was the U.S. invasion and the toppling of the Saddam Hussein regime that really was a catalyst for the ethno-religious violence that occurred throughout the region and really sparked the influence of the Islamic State throughout the region. Second, and kind of building on our first point, we have to trace back the rise of the Islamic State to the failure of the United States government to equitably integrate all conflicting ethno-religious groups within Iraq into the emerging political system. There was a great deal of deep deep-seated animosity that we just didn't recognize, or we didn't address. Now, most notably, the U.S. alienated Sunnis from participating in the Iraqi interim government and later the Iraqi transitional government. Okay, so we have Sunnis, Shias, and Kurds, which we'll talk about in a minute. But we alienated a large group of the population from the political process, and subsequently we got a tremendous amount of pushback, right? The Sunnis felt alienated. We start to see the emergence of extremist groups. Probably the most powerful is that al-Qaeda in Iraq, which was the precursor to the Islamic State. And we see a tremendous pushback against that Shia-dominated state. You know, we also, you know, even though we made significant gains to combat Sunni extremism, largely through recruitment of moderate Sunni leaders, and we're going to get into the details of this momentarily. We're just kind of getting an overview. We ultimately abandoned many of our allies. So we abandoned Sunni, moderate Sunni leaders. We abandoned Kurdish leaders in the north, and we allowed this Shia-dominated government to essentially take over the state, alienate these different groups, and ultimately foster an environment that was conducive to the growing of extremist groups, particularly the Islamic State. Lastly, the invasion of Iraq, it created instability within the broader region, right? It culminates in the Arab Spring, which on paper was supposed to be a series or a succession of democratic revolutions throughout the region. But however, what it did is it creates power vacuums, and it subsequently created an environment that allowed extremism to flourish and grow. It provided a certain level of safety. Okay, so that's in a nutshell where the Islamic State comes from, what it does, etc. But now let's get down into the details of those different facets here. So as we begin to analyze the origins of the Islamic State, we first need to really recognize the ethnic cleavages within Iraq, but they also are ethnic cleavages that characterize a number of Middle East states. So in Iraq, we tend to have three often competing socio-ethnic identities. We have the Shia, which is the dominant group, and it composes about 60% of the population, and it's generally concentrated in the southeast part of Iraq. And the southeast part of Iraq borders and has close shared historical ancestry, etc., ties with Iran, and that will play a significant role later in our discussion. So we also have the Sunnis, which are about 20% of the population. They occupy central and western Iraq. And we have the Kurds, which are a non-Arab population, but of Sunni religious background, that occupy much of northern Iraq. Now, in terms of political power, the Sunnis dominated major military and political positions from about 1979 until the U.S. invasion of 2003. I had something. Sorry, I missed the comment from someone. My apologies. So the Sunnis maintain the vast majority of political power from 79 to 2003. Okay, now this, of course, corresponds to the rule of Saddam Hussein, who was Sunni, and maintained his Sunni-backed Ba'athist party also dominated the government. So what do we see here? We see 20% of the population maintaining 100% of the political power within the region. So let's talk about how this relationship works with this Sunni minority against the Kurds and the Shia groups. So my apologies for the slide projection. Again, I had not run through this previously. Anyway, so we start to see political domination from the Sunni regime, the Saddam-backed regime. When Saddam is in power, he creates a tremendous amount of repression for both Shia and I do appreciate the help. I have my notes on one side and the PowerPoints on the other. And when I do anyway, under the Saddam Hussein regime, we start to see a tremendous amount of repression against the Sunni, the Shia and the Kurd. The Shia, at best of times, were just completely alienated from the political process. Okay. At the worst of times, they are set up for wholesale slaughter at the hands of the Iraqi government. So most notably during the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s, we see Saddam crack down on Shia groups, as well as following the Persian Gulf War in the 1991. Same thing happens with the Kurds. So Kurds occupy northern Iraq, parts of Turkey, Syria, Iran, etc., and they face a tremendous amount of repression under, again, a Sunni-dominated Saddam regime. So most notably, we have the incident at Halabja in 1998, when the Iraqi government gasses over 5,000 men, women, and children in Kurdistan. Okay, so what does all this mean? It means that for 25 years, Iraq is an ethnic powder keg. You know, and for those years, the ethnic conflict was prevented only through the Sunni-dominated, authoritarian, repressive Saddam Hussein regime. You know, so we have this long-standing, deep-rooted hatred between these ethnic groups. And when the United States invades and forces the Iraqi regime to collapse, we're left with essentially a power vacuum where we have these three factions fighting for some sort of control. So in 2003, hopefully this will come up. So in 2003, the United States topples that Sunni-dominated government. And now, in my opinion, one of the biggest mistakes that we made, you know, through the Coalition Provisional Authority, was implementing a policy called DeBaathification. So the concept of DeBaathification really stems from post-World War II policies, particularly denazification. Okay, so in World War II, anyone who had any affiliation with the Nazi regime is essentially stripped of any power that they have. They can't maintain a job, nothing. And we did the same thing in Iraq with Ba'ath Party members, which were, again, associated with the Saddam Hussein regime. Now, this leads to a tremendous amount of problems. Main problem is any professional that's working in the Iraqi political or economic sphere. I'm talking lawyers, doctors, members of the military, educators, teachers, civil servants, or whatever, was required to be a Ba'ath Party member. So let's think about what this does to your country if we decide that everyone will lose their job who has an association with the Ba'ath Party. So all educators are fired, from professors to kindergarten teachers. They're gone. Nearly all public servants, from bureaucrats, technocrats, they're all fired. And most problematic is the fact that we fire over 500,000 members of the military, stemming from the lowest enlisted ranks to general officers. This is problematic. Okay, and there's two main externalities that result from DeBaathification. First, the Sunnis, for all intents and purposes, are completely removed from the Iraqi political process. They're also removed from any involvement in Iraqi civil society. So that can be problematic. Second, the removal of Sunni Iraqis from government and other leadership positions leads to a massive influx of Shia into those positions of power. Now, Shia have been oppressed for over 25 years, and they are looking for some payback. So you're already seeing the seeds being planted for a really potential violent situation. Okay. So this political situation continues to grow worse. We start to see a tremendous amount of violence emerge between the Sunni and Shia factions. The Iraqi government largely supports, remember this is a new Shia government, supports militias and death squads that target Sunni Iraqis. Now, it really didn't hit rock bottom until we saw this election of Nouri al-Maliki to prime minister in, I believe, 2006. So Nouri al-Maliki was a Shia dissident, so again, backing the Shia parties and the Shia ethno-religious cleavages. He's a dissident under Saddam Hussein from the 70s until he left under penalty of death, in which he lived in exile for 25 years, trying to support some sort of shadow Iraqi Shia opposition. So he largely operates out of Iran and Syria. Okay, so is he the best actor to try and minimize this era of ethnic strife, being a diehard Shia operating within Iran, trying to overthrow the regime? Well, probably not. You know, Sunni al-Maliki is blatantly anti-Sunni. He launches a campaign of repression for any Sunni opposition political leaders. He fails to share any of the oil wealth in Iraq with the other ethnic groups. And these actions really began to anger the Sunni minority, and we start to see the Sunnis emerge in armed resistance. So what we see is a tremendous increase in deaths in Iraq with the election of Nouri al-Maliki. So right here, Nouri al-Maliki is elected. Boom, we see a spike in civilian deaths. So we're looking at, this is by month, so 3,200 killed, etc., throughout this early years of the Maliki regime. Now, is Nouri al-Maliki the end-all, be-all for this big spike in death? Well, no, but you know, deaths doubled in 6 months, and this suggests that at least ethnic war is increasing under the Maliki regime. So it's within this environment of political alienation and increasing ethnic violence that we start to see that precursor to the Islamic State emerge. And again, that's AQI, the Islamic State. Okay, so what we saw was a large sort of fractionalized number of organizations, Sunni organizations, Sunni insurgent groups operating against U.S. forces and the Iraqi government. Over time, they all start to coalesce under one umbrella, and that is this al-Qaeda in Iraq, led by Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, who was a Jordanian extremist who was initially tied closely with the al-Qaeda organization, most famously headed by Osama bin Laden. And the goals of the al-Qaeda in Iraq are similar to those of the Islamic State. You know, AQI seeks to establish an Islamic caliphate. They seek to spread war to Iraq's secular neighbors, most notably the Assad regime in Syria. They seek to engage in a broader war with Israel and what have you. So what's interesting to note is that in 2006, this al-Qaeda in Iraq retained a strong association with that broader al-Qaeda organization. However, this relationship wasn't to last. So under Zarqawi, pictured here, he launches a systematic assault not only on U.S. forces, not only on the Iraqi government, but he also launches a tremendous and violent ethnic war against Shia Muslims as well. AQI launches a number of suicide attacks, car bombing attacks. They round up and summarily execute Shia civilians. There's public torture, and probably most famously, we begin to see the beheadings. So the beheadings are not new. They're not just Islamic State. We can trace them back to the early 2000s as well. However, all this wholesale violence against fellow Muslims, in this case the Shia Muslims, we start to see a very strong pushback by the broader Muslim community, right? Public torture, etc. It's not going well. You know, even al-Qaeda starts to realize that AQI has gone too far. So for al-Qaeda, killing soldiers is fine. Killing contractors is fine. Killing Iraqi government officials is okay. But you really can't start killing fellow Muslims. So we start to see al-Qaeda start to distance itself from AQI in Iraq. So AQI at this time is continuing to plunge Iraq into a really nasty civil war. So let's take a look here. Well, what are we going to do about this? Well, at the height of the sectarian violence, U.S. forces led by General David Petraeus, they decided that we need to drastically increase the number of U.S. forces in Iraq in order to try and stem this free fall into just total chaos. And you know, this measure was to a point successful. Now, one of the most important or successful strategies against al-Qaeda in Iraq, again, that precursor to the Islamic State, was to train and equip moderate Sunni leaders in Western Iraq to combat AQI in Western Iraq. So what's interesting is the people that we decided to ally with and dump tremendous amounts of weapons, training, money, are the same people that killed U.S. soldiers in Fallujah and Ramadi, etc. But even these people thought al-Qaeda in Iraq, precursor to the Islamic State, was dangerous, problematic, and had to be stopped. So we start to see this serious decline in deaths in Iraq, largely due to what came to be known as the Surge. So, although the Sunni awakening. Um, sorry. Although the Sunni awakening and the U.S. troop surge really weakened Sunni extremist groups, they weren't destroyed. If anything, these really die-hard extremist groups went more underground in Iraq, and they also found sanctuary across the border in Syria. And here they sit from 2010 to 2011. But we begin to see the rise of the Arab Spring. So, Arab Spring, right? Tacitly, it's a series of democratic revolutions across the Middle East and North Africa. Many people frustrated with an authoritarian rule start demonstrations against the existing regime, and we start to see either A, democratic revolutions, or B, regimes start to severely crack down on demonstrators. At the very least, chaos starts to really spread out across the Middle East. Now, a particular note when we're talking about the Islamic State has to do with the civil war in Syria. So Syria is long dominated by a repressive regime controlled by the Shia minority. And at first, this civil war emerging out of the Arab Spring was characterized by two competing factions. We have a Shia-dominated Assad regime, and we have a semi-unified opposition. However, this semi-unified opposition did not last very long. We saw fractionalization of the opposition. We had fundamentalist groups. We had Sunni and Shia divisions. We had secular versus religious factions, etc. Now, one of the strongest opposition groups to emerge was what became now known as the Islamic State. These were the hardcore cadre emerging out of that al-Qaeda in Iraq, who had gained a tremendous amount of experience fighting U.S. forces and Iraqi government forces during our war there, and they took those skills and that training and that hardness into Syria. So they really began to make significant political gains. And what this political gains did is it really allowed the Islamic State to make a significant push into Western Iraq. And this is kind of where we're at now. The Islamic State makes a significant push into Western Iraq. They essentially drive the the Iraqi government forces back into Baghdad. They take territory from the Kurds. And there's a number of reasons why that's so, but I understand we're short on time. But at the very least, I hope that kind of gave a brief background of where the Islamic State comes from, and I'd like to open up to questions and see what we can do to discuss the current problem with the Islamic State, particularly in the West, including the United States, Europe, etc. So I will definitely open it up for questions if that's okay with Dr. Squires.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Arsenault. You mentioned there at the end about the Islamic State attacking Kurdistan. I was actually in Erbil teaching at the University of Kurdistan when that happened, and it caught a lot of people off guard. I was about an hour and 15-minute drive from Mosul when they overthrew Mosul, and no one expected that. And that's actually just shortly after that when they tried to attack Erbil, which is the capital of the autonomous Kurdistan region. That's when the U.S. intervened again, and in our most recent campaign there in Iraq. I got a question from a student. They read your profile about you being in Iraq and wanted to know if you could talk a little bit about what a civilian intelligence analyst is, and maybe you could speak a little bit about your experience during that time.
Sure. So part of what the Army was trying to do was to take people outside of Army intelligence. Army intelligence officers are trained to think one particular way. Academics are generally trained to think in a different way. So the idea was if you can have two different ways of thinking about these military problems, you're more likely to come up with an effective and an efficient solution. Um, the adage is if the only tool you have is a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. Army has a very big hammer, and they like to use their hammer. But sometimes, especially in insurgencies, hammers are not the best tool. So part of what I did was, let's think about these individuals in different contexts. So do we need to kill person X? Well, how bad are they? So my job was largely to say, okay, yeah, that guy's bad. He's got to go. This guy has potential. Let's try to engage this person. Let's try to work within the civil society. Let's try to at least tacitly get him to join our whatever our socio-political goals were in this small area. So it was working with the intelligence community to try and bring in a different perspective.
Okay, thank you. There's a couple of other questions. Let me see if I can kind of combine this. A couple of students want to know about ISIS's claims to tragic events. For example, well, there was some association. They're still trying to figure that out with the recent attack in New York, but there was also the Paris attack and other things like that. So maybe you could talk a little bit about some of the more high-profile attacks in the West that ISIS is doing. And another one wants to know about where they get their money from and how they fund this and how they're able to, I guess they're probably thinking in past how they were able to move so fast.
Yeah, I think those are all good questions. Let's answer the first one first. The connection to these terrorist attacks in Western Europe and most recently in the U.S. I think what's interesting about the Islamic State is we have this tremendous amount of internet presence for the Islamic State. People are radicalizing through the internet in these different countries, and they're largely conducting lone wolf attacks. So they have a very loose affiliation with the Islamic State. It's more as if they adopt this ideology, and through maintaining a similar ideology, they are part of the Islamic State. So I think it's a very decentralized organization, which is just going to make it extremely difficult to try and actually combat these type of lone wolf attacks. I think it's just an individual associating themselves with this broader organization and then acting on those ideologies.
How about the funding?
The funding. We have another colleague that, boy, I wish he were here from graduate school, who works in counter-terror finance. But my understanding is a lot of the funding comes from illegal oil. Oil revenues. So they can take over pipelines. They can steal oil out of the pipelines. That's part of it. A lot of kidnappings for ransom are funding terrorist organizations. And I don't know for certain, but I am sure there's a lot of wealthy Islamic extremists within many of the Gulf states that provide funding through a host of different mediums into these different organizations. I mean, Saudi Arabia consistently tries to, they say they consistently try to crack down on money leaving Saudi Arabia and going into different extremist groups, but it's just trying to put your finger in the dike of a bursting dam, I think. So there's plenty of money coming into these organizations.
And if I'm not mistaken, you could correct me, but they had a system of taxation in the caliphate as well. And when they were taking over different areas within Syria, and I know for a fact, like in Mosul, when they took over Mosul, the first thing that they did was took over the banks, and they estimated about $500 million in cash. So there's some strong-armed robbery as well, right?
Right. Yeah, certainly. You can go with the white collar route to cash, or you can just start Robbing banks. I mean, it's when you start to possess that much territory and you're able to control that territory, I think the amount of resources one can extract from that area is certainly not insignificant.
I
I
have
mean, they
another
also
question.
sure.
I have another. Sorry to interrupt. I have another question from a student. Wants to know if you can explain the relationship between Russia, the U.S., ISIS, Syria, and all of that. I mean, it's a very complicated issue, but could you give us the brief sort of overview of what's going on there?
Yes, very complex question. I guess the first way that I would address it is we have to look at the role of Russia. I actually just had a very interesting speaker in one of my classes a couple days ago talking about the fact that Russia seeks to destabilize much of the world by destabilizing much of the globe through this concept of hybrid warfare. So backing different insurgent groups, using social media, the internet, etc. They're able to try and destabilize different regimes, including the United States. So by destabilize, I don't mean the collapse of the U.S. government, but what we see is a tremendous amount of gridlock and opposition and paranoia on the part of our legislatures where nothing gets done. And when nothing gets done, Russia wins. So they do have an interest in destabilizing the U.S. in that way. They also have close ties with the Iranian regime. There's a pretty tight alliance between these two states. And if we look at the Middle East in general, Iran is making a very strong push to become a hegemon of that region. It's largely a balance between Iran and Saudi Arabia. And to an extent, the U.S. backs Saudi Arabia, Russia backs Iran, and it's old school power politics, power balancing within the region at this time. I wish we had more time to really delve into that question, but there's a lot there.
Another question for you, Dr. Arsenault, if you would. A student named Nathaniel would like to know where they get their weapons.
Well, that's one of the major ways that they got weapons was it was that 500,000 Iraqi military members that we essentially put on the unemployment list. They left with weapons. They were a lot of them moved into that role of those Sunni insurgent groups. When they came back into Iraq from Syria, they took tremendous amounts of weapons from the Iraqi government forces, which we had left there, and that was certainly problematic. What it's interesting to note is kind of an aside. We have our mine-resistant vehicles, our MRAPs, that we left with the Iraqi government, and they're now being used as massive suicide car bombs. So essentially, you can't stop these vehicles. They're packed with explosives. And they're driven in and just blowing blocks of city apart. It's tremendous. But bottom line, they're getting their weapons largely from the Iraqi government as they start to overrun these different positions.
That's including artillery, which they didn't have until they invaded Iraq.
Right.
One of the things that was sort of going around as a rumor when I was in Iraq is that when ISIS invaded Iraq and took over large areas of that, there was wide-scale speculation among the Kurdish people that they were ordered to stand down on purpose, and the idea was that Ba'athist loyalists that we still had positions of power within the Iraqi government were to blame. What do you think about that?
That the Iraqi forces were forced to stand down?
On purpose. That's a sort of inside job, if you would.
I think there's two issues there. The first is that the Iraqi military is dominated by Shia forces, and I think the Iraqi government feared putting Shia forces into traditionally held Sunni areas. There's a fear of um, sparking ethnic violence. So not only do you have to deal with the Islamic State, but now you have to deal with the disillusioned Baathists, those moderate Sunni tribes that at one point in time fought the Islamic State. I think that was a fear of the Iraqi government, and I think it parallels the fact that they really had no support for Kurdish forces as well. When the Kurdish forces are fighting the Islamic State, there was very little support from Baghdad in that case. It's kind of, I think, that concept of divide and conquer, and coupled with the strong desire to maintain that Shia-dominated government.
Okay, let's take one more question. This is actually from one of my students, Linda. She wants to know, well, first she says that ISIS has brought terrorism to a new extreme. I want to get your thoughts on that. And then also, she wants to know whether or not that this is something that will be resolved peacefully eventually or not.
To answer the first part of the question, yes, the Islamic State has brought terrorism to a new extreme. Part of it is we've seen a shift to what many call new terrorism. So old terrorism generally stemmed from nationalist conflicts. There were surgical strikes to target particular symbols and what have you. Assassinations, hijackings, and what have you. The new terrorism is ground by this sort of supernatural sort of motivation, right? It's a religious guided motivation. We see mass casualty attacks. We see the desire to just inflict as many casualties as we possibly can. We also see this drastic increase in the use of technology, internet technology, and what have you, to radicalize people thousands and thousands of miles away towards their cause. The Islamic State is a brand. It's a brand, and they're doing a hell of a job marketing their brand to a lot of disillusioned people and getting them to act on their behalf. Will it end peacefully? I don't think so. I don't think so. Some people say we need to control the narrative, right? We need to be able to head off this radicalization and what have you. I don't see that being feasible. Perhaps I'm jaded. I think the only way to contain, and I don't think we'll ever get rid of the Islamic State per se, or radical Islam or what have you. The only way to contain is continue with those targeted strikes, counterterrorism efforts, try to kill as many of the leadership as we can. But even then, I feel like we're fighting an uphill battle.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Arsenault, for coming and sharing your expertise and wisdom with us today. We really appreciate that.
Thank you, and I apologize for the PowerPoint. I apologize for the PowerPoint mishap. I should have ran through that earlier.
No worries. We're happy to have you here. Just a note for all of you students, we've just posted a link to a survey. If you are attending for extra credit, make sure that you fill out that survey. And even if you're not, we'd like to hear your thoughts, and let us know. This is the first time we've tried this, so we want to, improve and see maybe what you'd like to see from this series in the future. Once again, thank you very much, Dr. Arsenault.
Thank you for the opportunity. I enjoyed it.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.